Well, Jim Carr is Canada's Minister of Trade Diversification, and he is with me in our studio now to talk about this WTO meeting. Good to see you. Thanks for being here.
I'm glad to be here. It's an important day.
Yeah, it is. What are you hoping to achieve as you get together with colleagues from a dozen other countries to talk about how to reform the WTO?
That we have a spirited conversation about how we can be creative to reform an institution that has 164 members. It's complicated. But where do you start? You start with people who believe in a rules-based international system. You give them some thought-provoking ideas to stimulate what I hope will be a dynamic chat over the next day and a bit, and to try to roll out that consensus into a wider group. So that's why we're doing it. Ottawa is a good place because actually people like coming here. They like us. We're affable.
And I think you said before, Canada's good at sort of organizing meetings. Canada does.
Yeah, we convene really well, and we also convene with a history of being good at it. So there's a bit of a track record, which is helpful.
Well, you'll have to be good at this. I mean,
yeah.
This is a challenge. I mean, you have the two biggest members of the WTO aren't going to be at these meetings, haven't been invited. That's the USA and China. Why not?
Because we're starting with a group representing every continent in the globe that believes that the rules-based order is good for everybody. We'll start with that. These are not the largest powers in the world, and we think that that's probably the way that we can gather momentum from the start and then roll that momentum to others.
Does that suggest you don't think the USA right now believes in a rules-based order?
Well, we know that there are protectionist forces around the world, and we're not among them. And we want to be able to fashion arguments that the World Trade Organization can be reformed in ways that would make even those countries more comfortable. We all want a rules-based system that's certain and predictable, and that's not how many nations feel about the WTO today. It's time that it was reformed. Everybody agrees to that. Now we have to find out the pace that we can go under the circumstances and how we can best achieve a consensus with this group and then move it to a wider one.
When the WTO was created in 1995, I mean, the U.S. was the driving force behind it in many ways, and now Donald Trump doesn't seem to be an international trade rules guy. He seems to be more interested in using U.S. power to decide what trade deals will work for the United States and which won't. But let's explore some of his concerns. I mean, at least a little bit. Where do we start? It's a long list. Its dealings with China. It doesn't like the way the WTO has, he believes, let China get away with a lot of stuff in a non-market economy. A failure to adequately penalize trade distorted by public subsidies and lax protections for intellectual property, turning a blind eye to rules violations by developing countries, unfair judicial decisions against the United States. Does he have a point?
Well, he has every right to express his point, which he has done, and it's done in certain terms. But then you have to go to the next set of questions. How do we change it? And how do we reform it in a way that meets the requirements of an international system? There are 164 member countries in the WTO. To achieve consensus among all of them is really, really difficult. And there are other countries that have very firmly held points of view about how to reform it as well on a rule-based system, a dispute settlement mechanism, the question of notification, how the rules can be changed. But the point is, where do you start? Or do you just allow inertia to entrench the status quo? That's not a happy place for most of the members of the WTO.
Right. I mean, but to be clear, if I can, what's really happening here is that there's a trade fight, there's a trade war now between the USA and China, and the USA wants the WTO to do something about it. Where does Canada stand on that?
Canada wants the rules to be clear, and it wants to have the support of the international community in that clarity, and that's why we're doing what we're doing.
Okay. What are you proposing as a way forward?
To spend the next day and a half looking at various proposals from...
But Canada has a proposal.
They're thought starters, and we distributed this document a couple of weeks ago. People have responded to it. We're not the only group looking at WTO reform. There are others. We want to make sure that, there's alignment with those other conversations that are happening simultaneously. But again, if you know you got a problem, and there's a willingness to try to grapple with the problem, where do you start? And our answer to that question is a country such as Canada, well positioned to invite another 12 to begin to have this conversation in a constructive way that we could then move and invite others to join.
I guess at the end of the day, does the U.S. can you have a WTO without the United States?
Why would we want to have a WTO without the United States? So that's where you start. You want to be able to reform it in a way that satisfies the agendas of the nation states, always aligning what we believe to be the common interest. And that's the most important point to make, I think, Peter, and that is that it's in everybody's interests to have a rules-based international trading system. How that exactly looks is not clear to us today. I'm hoping that over the next number of months it'll become clear.
Why is the WTO's, in your view, and it may not be a view shared by the U.S. side, and maybe at some point not even by China, but from Canada's point of view, why is the WTO's survival so important? What happens if there's no WTO?
Well, I guess you could say that if it didn't exist, it would have to be created. And maybe it would be created in a different form. That's what this is all about. But you have to start from an assumption that I think is a shared one, that what the WTO offers is in the international interest. And now we have to make sure that the nation states who make it up believe that it's in their interests too. And it's not easy. It's complicated. It's been around a while. It hasn't been reformed in too long. But we know that the alternative is doing nothing, and we know that that leads to a bad place.
And the clock's ticking here, right? I mean, the United States has used its veto power to shrink the size of the appellate tribunal for the World Trade Organization, and I think two of those judges take their retirement at the end of next year.
That's right.
And it effectively will shut down the appellate process for the WTO. Won't be able to rule on anything. So at that point, it's essentially useless, isn't it? So you're up against the clock here.
Well, that's where the word urgency comes into the mix, and that's why we're moving. But you can only move as quickly as the member states can sustain and withstand and welcome. But you have to get moving with a sense of the clock ticking, and that's the balance that we have to strike.
Okay, a couple of quick questions. You're off next month to China.
Yes.
What for?
To continue a very important conversation with our Chinese partners to broaden and deepen our trading relationship with the second largest economy in the world.
Are you looking for a free trade deal? Because that won't make the Americans happy either.
Well, there are all kinds of ways that we can deepen the relationship. I mean, how about that terrific news 2 weeks ago that Shell is going to be investing $40 billion in Canadian LNG? Where do you think that LNG is going? It's going to be displacing coal-fired power in Asia, including in China. There'll be lots to discuss. And we think that there's a willingness to broaden and deepen the relationship. So Minister Morneau and I will go there with an open mind. You also have to build personal relationships. And you can't emphasize that enough because it matters a lot. So that means that we have to keep going, and they have to come here, and we have to build on what I think is a pretty good platform.
I don't know if careful is the right word, but how careful do you have to be in the conversations? I mean, do you ultimately want a free trade deal with China? Because we know in the new deal you have with the United States, if you sign a deal with a non-market economy, the United States can walk away from the deal you have with them after 6 months.
Yeah, but they can do that anyway.
Right.
They can walk away from that deal for any reason at any time with 6 months' notice, as they can currently with NAFTA.
So
that doesn't represent a change at all. What we have to do is inform our partners, the United States and Mexico, if we are moving into a formal discussion of a free trade arrangement with a non-market economy. But that's reciprocal. The Americans have the same obligation to inform us too.
But ultimately, is that Canada's intention? You want a free trade deal with China?
We're looking for ways of broadening and deepening the relationship because this is an important economy. It's an important trading partner.
So that's not a no.
It's not a no.
So you could be looking for a free trade deal.
Let's see where it goes. One step at a time, just like WTO reform.
All right, Jim Carr, thanks for your time. Appreciate it.
It's my pleasure.